In the novel Saint Maybe by Anne Tyler, we meet a 19-year-old named Ian who decides to make a major detour in his life, a decision that involves giving up his college career and his life plans. Instead, he's going to raise his brother's now orphaned children and take on a job in the skilled trades. There's a lot of backstory here, but Ian comes to this life-altering course change because of the influence of a new church that he has joined. A church that goes by the name Church of the Second Chance. The Church of the Second Chance is a rather different kind of church, you see, from the typical traditional mainline Protestant congregation where Ian's parents had raised him and the whole family, a typical mainline Protestant church like we are. When Ian tells his parents of his decision to change course in life, well, his parents don't exactly take that so well, to say the least. All they hear in his words is dropping out. After further back and forth about Ian's plans and his parents' disapproval, the conversation takes an even more intense turn when matters of church and faith enter the conversation. Ian mentions that he's going to have help from his church in juggling his new job and the responsibility for the children that he has decided to help raise. This alarms his parents. Ian, have you fallen into the hands of some sect? His father asks. No, I haven't, Ian said. I merely discovered a church that makes sense to me, the same as Dover Street Presbyterian makes sense to you and Mom. Dover Street didn't ask us to abandon our educations, his mother told him. Of course, we have nothing against religion. We raised all of you children to be Christians. But our church never asked us to abandon our entire way of life. Well, maybe it should have, Ian said. Ian's parents were not only shocked and dismayed by his abrupt change in course, but all the more alarmed when it became known that a church of all things, a strange kind of church, was at least in part responsible. After all, plenty of people, like Ian's parents, probably, think of their religious participation as simply one of the things that they choose to engage in, a hobby, a special interest, one of the things they might choose to do amidst a panoply of other possibilities like soccer or volunteering at the hospital or playing an instrument or being active with a political party. The idea that church, or moreover, God through church, might lead to such a radical redirection of one's life, well, that's not exactly the sort of thing that most of us expect in today's world, especially us in the traditional, typical, mainline sort of traditions. When it does, when this sort of startling change and redirection does take place, many of us might be as startled as were Ian's parents. And yet, that is exactly the sort of thing that we hear about in today's reading from the Gospel of Matthew. I can imagine that James and John, these ones who followed Jesus after Jesus simply walked by the lakeshore and said, "Hey, come follow me." I can imagine that James and John never heard the end of it from their father Zebedee. Whenever they gathered with their family for Christmas and Thanksgiving, it would come up. After getting a few drinks in him, Zebedee would mutter in disbelief that his two sons had turned their back on the family business. Would wail and shout that they would rather follow some crazy rabbi and beg for food from people with real jobs and sleep in the home of strangers, a new bed every night. Wasn't much better when they called their father on the phone either. Old Zebedee would complain about how his fingers ached from mending all those nets by himself.
He would moan about how his back is sore from hauling in all the fish without
anyone to help. He would speak mournfully about what is he supposed to do with the family boat when he was too old to work anymore, now that there was nobody left to put it to use.
It's a hard thing to put down your nets and follow Jesus. It's a hard thing to give up everything
to follow a calling.
I remember hearing a few years ago from a friend a bit of her reflection on this
story about Jesus and Zebedee and James and John. She shared how she had decided to pursue a path different from everyone else in her family. She shared the experience of breaking with the family business, of breaking with the expectations of her parents and setting her own course as she followed her own call. It's a classic story. I'm sure you know it. You know, a girl grows up in the family of artists and becomes the black sheep. She becomes a lawyer. And if it's hard to go against the expectations that your family has for you, it's also hard to pivot and go against all the expectations that you have for you. After all, we all have plans of some sort or another for our lives. Visions or imaginations or at least wonderments about what we might do, of what sort of people we might become. To some extent, even if it's foggy or a little unclear, we have a little idea of the path we might follow in our life. And when we hear a call that leads away from that path, it can be incredibly difficult to let go of those expectations, those visions, those plans that we have for ourselves. It can be terrifying to step off into an unknown direction, on an unknown path, following after a voice calling to us. I may have told you this before, but I do remember the day in my senior year of college when I told my parents that I was going to seminary. It was January. We'd been back from Christmas a few weeks, and my parents had stopped by while they were in town running some errands. They sat in my dorm room. My mom started asking me about my application process for grad school. You see, as I know some of you know, I was a computer science major as an undergrad, and my plan for quite some time had been to go on to grad school in order to be able to teach at the college level. My mom, she commented that she hadn't heard me talking about that for a bit. Well, I said, I've decided I'm not going to grad school in computer science. Oh, really? Yeah, I'm actually applying to go to seminary. There was a stunned look, silence as she sat there on the lounger. My parents weren't upset or anything. After all, we grew up a church-growing family. I mean, this wasn't like completely black sheep territory. But for them, this had come out of the blue. If you had told them even a few months, let alone a few years earlier, that I was going to head to seminary, they would have said, yeah, right. And for me too, this whole sense of call and responding to it had also in its own way come out of the blue for me as well. I mean, by the time I had told my parents this, I had been wrestling with this dilemma, this call, and whether to follow it for nearly a year. But prior to that point, it certainly was not anything that I had had in mind. So all of this was a bit surprising and unsettling, to be honest. But in its own way, it was also an exciting and a life-giving time, learning to let go, learning to put down things that I once had thought were important, learning to trust the voice calling to me. And when I gave into that sense of call and finally made that decision that, okay, I guess I will apply
to seminary. I had a sense of peace within that I had not had in quite a long time, and certainly not over any of that preceding year. It was like I was seeing the world for the first time again, alive with possibility. I imagine you'll be happy to hear that I do not regret following this path. It has led me to people I would have never met, to places I would have never traveled, experiences I would have never imagined. A sense of purpose and fulfillment, too. A friend of ours, who I was telling you about a moment ago, who chose the road less traveled in order to become a lawyer, she would say the same. Though she could not have foreseen it when she first set out to follow the voice that called to her, that law degree, in fact, led her to the church. It led her to working as a lay person with clergy and lay people in crisis. It has led her to safeguarding God's people. It has led her to creating restoration and reconciliation for communities filled with conflict and pain. In your own lives, you too, I trust, in some way, at some moment, have had the experience of following a call that led in an unexpected direction. Perhaps it was not the direction your parents or your family expected. Perhaps it was not the direction that you expected. You too, I imagine, have known uncertainty, destabilization, as well as excitement and the exhilaration of charting a new course. Perhaps you too have found a deeper sense of purpose and fulfillment as you follow the voice of Jesus calling to you in whatever form that voice has taken, even if you didn't recognize where the voice was coming from. And yet, I still, nevertheless, in hearing Jesus' call to Simon and Andrew, to James and John, I still feel a little bit anxious. A part of me feels this familiar sense of dread, because after the uncertainty of once following down a new path, I did that once, changed course, and now the rhythms of my life are stable again. I'm content in the knowledge that I am fulfilling my call, or at least what I assumed to be my call at one point. Perhaps you feel the same way too. You're doing good work in your life. You have families to look after, bills to pay, obligations to keep. The thought that Jesus might be calling us again, that Jesus might be calling me or you to put down the new nets that you are now tending, well, that's unnerving. Makes you want to cry out, "How many times, Lord?" I'm afraid I already know the answer. Because call is not something we only see in the rearview mirror. The call of God, the call of Christ to follow, believe it or not, continues to speak into our lives today, no matter how old we are, no matter where we are on the journey. No matter how times we have turned to follow Jesus before, Jesus finds us wherever we are tending our nets now and calls us to follow anew. God is still and always active and present in our world. We're called to join Christ in his work in this world, a call that always comes ever and ever again. That may be, on one hand, challenging, that we're never done getting unsettled and disrupted and changed. And yet, it also speaks so deeply to God's great trust in us. God's great trust in us, in you and me, in us together. In good times and in bad, God invites us to lay aside all the gnarly nets, familiar and comfortable as they may be, yet nevertheless nets that trap us in their tangled webs and take up all our attention and energy. Lay it aside. Follow me and find your purpose yet again today. Indeed, today may very well be the day that Jesus somehow in some way shows up out there across the street right beside the shores of our great Mirror Lake to call out in my direction, "Hey Matt, come, follow me." Today may very well be the day that Jesus shows up over there beside Mirror Lake to call out in your direction, "Hey Rob, hey Ed, hey Donna, hey Tyler, come and follow me." Just because you hear and follow what seems to be a call from God at one moment in your life does not mean that that phone will not ring again. Responding to God's call is not a once and for all proposition. It is, in fact, an ongoing gift that God presents to us again and again, each and every day. Blessing and honor, glory and power be unto God, now and forever. Amen.